Today's story, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Small Worlds, has a bit of a confusing backstory to it, given that this is not the original Ant-Man or the original Wasp, who actually is the original Ant-Man. Confused yet? Well, I'm sure if most of you are familiar with Marvel's cinematic universe, then you know that this all starts with a man named Hank Pym.
Hank Pym debuted in the 27th issue of the anthology comic Tales to Astonish. In the story, Pym discovered a unique grouping of subatomic particles that could be manipulated into altering the size of an object, but allowing that object to maintain its molecular density.
Basically what this means is, even though an object would be reduced to the size of an ant, it would still maintain the strength it had at its normal height, and not just, crumble into dust.
Pym tested a serum containing the particles on himself. Upon shrinking, he became disoriented and wound up getting tangled up in an ant colony. He then almost got washed down his own drain before managing to just barely get to a reversal serum that restored his height. Afterwards, Pym decided the serum was far too dangerous for human consumption and destroyed his research.
Response to the story was positive enough that Marvel decided to bring back Hank Pym as a superhero in Tales to Astonish issue number 35.
That story revealed that Hank had returned to researching the Pym particles, as they came to be called, and he also developed a cybernetic helmet that allowed him to communicate with ants, inspired by the incident in the anthill. Pym's colleagues mocked him over his research, as they found no merit in it, but Hank was undaunted. Hank also married his college sweetheart, a Hungarian refugee named Maria Torovaya. Hank and Maria went to Hungary on their honeymoon in an attempt to rescue Maria's father. However, the three were soon jumped by KGB agents, and Hank was knocked unconscious while Maria and her father were executed. Afterwards, Pym swore to honor Maria's memory by using his research to fight injustice.
Hank would have many solo adventures in Tales to Astonish until issue number 44, when he was visited by a former colleague, Dr. Vernon Van Dyne, who was accompanied by his daughter, Janet.
Dr. Van Dyne wanted Hank's assistance in helping to contact alien life. Hank refused, but as the doctor left with his daughter, Hank couldn't help but notice that Janet looked an awful lot like Maria. A few days later, a tearful Janet contacted Hank. Her father had tried conducting an experiment with a gamma portal. Unfortunately, a creature came through the portal and killed Dr. Van Dyne, with Janet discovering the body afterwards. Hank then revealed to Janet his identity as Ant-Man, and she gave him permission to let him use the Pym particles on her so that they could work together in avenging her father. Hank also performed a medical procedure which allowed Janet to be sporting biomechanical wasp wings at her reduced state. Janet also got a stinger gun to blast opponents with small electrical discharges, though this would be later modified into the gauntlets of her costume. Ant-Man and the Wasp, as Janet would come to be called, would defeat the creature responsible for Dr. Van Dyne's death. Afterwards, Janet elected to stay with Hank. She was developing feelings for him, but the still mourning Hank tried to keep things cordial. Soon afterwards, the two would go on to become founding members of Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers.
Not too long after founding the Avengers, Hank modified a set of Pym particles to allow him to grow to a gigantic height, thus leading him to adopt the new moniker of Giant Man. Why did he do this? Well, Hank had suffered from a lifelong inferiority complex, and this was exacerbated by being in a team with both the Hulk and Thor, both of whom would wind up teasing Hank over the inherent goofiness of his powers. Also, at one point, Hank had unintentionally discovered Tony Stark's identity as Iron Man, and he feared that at some point Jen would drop him in favor of someone like Stark, who was just as smart and better looking. We might revisit that at some point.
It wasn't all bad, though. In fact, it was mostly good, as Hank and Janet finally started a relationship, and Janet herself went on to become a fashion designer specializing in superhero outfits.
Jan's career as a fashion designer was kind of funny, given the fact that the Wasp has had some of the dumbest looking outfits throughout the entire history of comic books. My personal favorite being this George Perez model with the side boob and the completely exposed left leg. I'm sure that really aided her in battle.
Hank and Janet would take periodic breaks from the Avengers for Hank to continue his research. One of Hank's projects was a robot capable of increasing its intelligence and upgrading its physical form. However, during one of the experiments, something went wrong, and Hank inhaled several noxious chemicals and collapsed. Hank wasn't killed, but when he came to, his robot, Ultron, was missing.
Now look, I know that there's a whole tangled web involving Ultron and his relationship to Hank and Janet, but that's just going to have to wait for its own separate episode.
The chemical exposure had a side effect on Hank, as he would adapt the identity of the swashbuckling Yellow Jacket. In this new persona, Hank became more aggressive and also had a devil-may-care aspect to his personality. However, Janet managed to see through it enough to accept Hank's marriage proposal. The two were married in Avengers issue number 60, and it would be all downhill from there.
Some of you may remember that the first time I did one of these supplemental episodes, it talked about how Carol Danvers was essentially ruined in just one comic book story. Well, you could kind of say the same applies to Hank Pym. Coincidentally, both they do have something in common. Jim Shooter.
It really began at the end of Avengers issue number 212. Captain America negotiated a ceasefire with a villain, the Elf Queen. Yellow Jacket, though, wasn't paying attention and wound up attacking Elf Queen. As a result, Hank was suspended for the Avengers pending a hearing where he could defend his actions. Irate, Hank disappeared into his lab for a few days. Janet went down into the lab to check on Hank, only to find Hank working on a robot that would attack and interrupt the hearing. Being the only one who knew the robot's weakness, Hank would stop it and thus save the day. Janet begged Hank to stop, calm down, and just argue his case, and also apologize. Hank wheeled around and struck Janet, knocking her to the ground.
I should point out that Jim Shooter has stated on numerous occasions that he intended for the strike to be more inadvertent, Hank not realizing that Janet was standing right behind him as he was gesturing while turning around. Unfortunately, he forgot to include that little direction in the script, which led artist Bob Hull to draw the act as more intentional, like what you're seeing right now.
The next day at the hearing, Jan arrived wearing glasses. As Hank tried to make his case, Jan removed the glasses to show the black eye Hank's hit had given her. Hank just told Janet to shut up. Suffice to say, Hank was kicked off the Avengers, with Janet filing for divorce soon after. Hank Pym was left bankrupt after his expulsion from the Avengers and subsequent divorce. Meanwhile, Janet began a short-lived relationship with Tony Stark.
Now bear in mind, Hank knew that Tony was Iron Man. Jan did not. In fact, she would actually end the relationship upon discovering that Tony was Iron Man. So, in other words, yeah, Tony was basically using his superhero identity to get with a comrade's ex-wife in the wake of that relationship falling apart. To me, this is just confirmation that comic book Iron Man is a way bigger douche than movie Iron Man is.
Not too long after that, readers would be introduced to a new man named Scott Lang. Lang was a former electrical engineer who turned to burglary in order to support his wife and young daughter. Lang was arrested and served 4 years in prison. In that time, his wife divorced him. Scott also furthered his electrical studies and was hired by Stark International upon his release. However, it was then that Scott's daughter Cassie became deathly ill. The only medical doctor that could treat Cassie was Erica Sondheim, who had recently been taken hostage by evil industrial magnate Darren Cross. Having no other choice, Lang broke into Hank Pym's home and stole an Ant-Man suit along with a canister of Pym particles. Lang freed Sondheim, who was able to treat Cassie. Though Lang intended to return the suit, Pym allowed Scott to keep the suit, providing that he used his abilities to help others. Scott Lang kept his promise, becoming a hero and earning the respect of many, in particular his daughter Cassie. Scott gave Cassie to his ex-wife after she remarried, and he himself would go on to join his Avengers. While Hank Pym worked on the road to redemption and Scott Lang found his way in the superhero world, Janet Van Dyne flourished. The Wasp had a lengthy term as leader of the Avengers. In fact, Janet was leading the team in the story I've reviewed on the show, the classic Under Siege. Eventually, Janet forgave Hank, and the two would wind up making several attempts at reconciling their relationship.
Here's what I said earlier about how one story could ruin a character does apply. The fact is, Hank and Jan were a great couple. They got along. They worked. People wanted these two to be together. Problem is every time a new creative team would comment on the Avengers and then try to get Hank and Janet back together, there'd always be one naysayer to come back and bring up that, yeah, he hit her once. It's tough to get over that. And as a result, the relationship would just be kind of on again, off again, on again, off again.
During the off periods with Hank, Jan had brief relationships with Paladin, an internationally wanted cat burglar, and Clint Barton, the Avenger known as Hawkeye. That last relationship would lead to a rather watershed moment for Janet, as one day she was lounging by the pool at Avengers Mansion with Wanda Maximoff, aka the Scarlet Witch, and Jan mentioned how a dalliance with Hawkeye had resulted in a pregnancy scare. When Wanda probed further, Jan said that she really wasn't ready to be a parent, or if she even wanted to risk exposing a child to the superhero life. She then marveled at the fact that Wanda had tried to have twins at one point.
That one little line from Jan is what set the Scarlet Witch on her path to a mental breakdown as depicted in the story called Avengers Disassembled. Now, you can look at my House of M review for a bit more of an elaboration on this, but there was one noteworthy casualty at the beginning of the story.
The Avengers were surprised by the sudden appearance of Jack of Hearts, a member who had died protecting Cassie Lang. Scott Lang ran out to see what was happening. Jack of Hearts exploded, causing Scott to be completely incinerated. Scott Lang's death devastated Cassie. She had long admired her father, much to the chagrin of her mother and stepfather. Cassie would frequently visit Stark Industries headquarters, attempting to just find information on her father's death. Her mother and stepfather would eventually be called to pick her up. It was then that Cassie heard about a group of teenage superheroes called the Young Avengers. She, along with a young woman named Kate Bishop, sought the group out and attempted to join. Cassie was rejected due to the belief that she didn't have any powers. Irate, Cassie revealed that she had exposed herself to pin particles for years, this was without her father's knowledge, and enlarged to a great height. Cassie would join the Young Avengers under the name Stature. She could both shrink and enlarge, the change in her personality. While on the team, Cassie would have a brief romance with the founder Iron Lad and the teenage incarnation of the robot Vision.
Again, we're going to have to save that for another video.
On one mission, the Young Avengers, along with Dr. Doom and the Scarlet Witch, traveled back to the events of Avengers Disassembled. There, Cassie managed to intercede in Scott's death and bring him back to the present. Unfortunately, soon after returning, Cassie herself would be killed by Dr. Doom.
During the events of a storyline called Axis, in which several heroes and villains all had their personalities inverted, Dr. Doom would resurrect Cassie Lang. She would be briefly depowered after that, and eventually she would regain her powers and earn the blessing of her mother to become a superhero like her father. Following the events of Avengers Disassembled, Hank and Janet would move to Europe in a last-ditch attempt to save their relationship. It didn't work, and Hank would soon return to the United States and take up a research position with Tony Stark's company, as Stark had just been named Secretary of Defense in the wake of the Civil War storyline.
It was around this time that a new model Ant-Man suit came into possession of a low-level S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named Eric O'Grady. O'Grady, however, did not don the suit of altruism. Rather, he did this to further his own standing within S.H.I.E.L.D. Eric also used his newfound suit to steal things, and most notably all, he used it to sneak into the home of Carol Danvers, aka Miss Marvel, so he could spy on her in the shower. It would later be revealed that Eric actually took the suit off a fellow S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, Chris McCarthy. He then seduced Chris McCarthy's girlfriend, Veronica, and when he found out Veronica was pregnant, O'Grady fled.
O'Grady would slowly come around and begin to act a little bit more like a hero, even joining two super teams, the Thunderbolts and the Avengers. Eventually, he would even try to pursue a serious relationship with a woman named Abigail. He's the Ant-Man in today's story. As for the Wasp, well, in this case, we're going to have to jump all the way back to the 5th story I covered on this show, Secret Invasion.
In the story, it was revealed that Hank Pym was really an agent of the shape-shifting alien race known as the Skrulls. That Skrull gave Jan a new version of the Pym particles under the guise that it would aid her in growing, like Giant Man. In reality, Jan was turned into a biological weapon that would explode and kill all organic life. As a last-ditch effort to save the city of New York and its heroes, Thor used his enchanted hammer Mjolnir to create a spatial warp tornado that apparently transported the Wasp away to die. Afterwards, Hank Pym, the real one, was discovered in the wreckage of a Skrull ship. Upon hearing of Janet's death, Hank Pym adopted the identity of the Wasp in tribute to her.
Now, if you remember that a few months ago, I reviewed the first story arc of Uncanny Avengers, and in there, it's obvious that Jen did return to the land of the living. But that's a story we're going to have to wait for a later time. Anyway, I'm just trying to best set the stage for today's story, Ant-Man and Wasp: Small Worlds. That's why I have also left out a few different size changers. For example, the numerous people to wear the mantle of Goliath, and the second Yellow Jacket. So, tune in to part 2 of this, where we cover Ant-Man and Wasp: Small Worlds.